Rain had been falling since dawn, thin at first, then hard enough to flatten the straw in the York posting yard and turn the ruts to black paste. Patricia Eriksson walked beside the market cart because there was no room left on the plank seat, and because the driver had looked once at her patched skirt and said, without cruelty and without concern, "You can keep pace if you wish." She kept pace. Mud climbed her hem in dark fans. Water slipped through the split in her left boot and sat cold against her stocking until her toes went numb and then began to ache. She held the bundled lace parcels under her shawl as if her own body were no more than wrapping for Lady Eriksson's profit. Wheels struck stones, harness chains clinked. Men shouted prices over crates of geese and turnips. None of it stopped for her. A pair of gentlemen under a broad umbrella watched her pass, saw her face, then found sudden fascination in the sky. Two ladies in plum silk stepped down from a hired chaise, one whispering, plain as flour sack, loud enough to bruise, while the other lifted her skirts away from Patricia's splash as though poverty could stain satin by touch alone. Patricia lowered her eyes and kept moving. Wet, dark hair had come loose from its pins and clung to her throat. Her face, pale with cold, gave her the severe look of a carved figure in a church stone, but her eyes were wide and grave and too alive to be ignored. Strangers looked twice, then remembered rank, then looked away quickly, or almost angrily, as if her existence had accused them of a debt they had not agreed to owe. By the time the cart reached the long row of coaching sheds near Micklegate Bar, the skin at Patricia's heels had rubbed raw. Each step made a small hot line beneath the cold. She had learned the measure of pain in fractions, the pinch of wet leather, the chafe of rough seam, the slow sting when water found broken skin. Her fingers were worse. Lye had cracked them at the knuckles from winter washing, and this morning's rain had worked itself into every split, so that even tightening her grip on the parcels sent a bright pulse up her hands. She tucked her wrists beneath the shawl when she could, not for warmth, but to hide the redness that marked her as house labour in a district where ladies pretended servants did not bleed. Hunger sat low in her middle, no longer a sharp complaint, but a steady hollow weight. She had eaten yesterday's crust before dawn and kept half of it in her sleeve, wrapped in a clean scrap, for the walk back. She measured hours by when she might allow herself one bite and whether she could do it unsteen. A cough gathered behind her breastbone, rough and insistently deep, and she swallowed it down until her throat burned. Lady Eriksson called coughing theatrics. The last time Patricia had coughed through supper, her plate had been removed untouched, and the kitchen maid instructed not to encourage weakness. So she pressed her tongue to the roof of her mouth and let the need pass through her like a blade. The market boys ran past with bundles of kindling, laughing, and a mule kicked against a post hard enough to rattle the iron ring. Patricia stood in the rain and waited for the clerk's signature on the first delivery ticket. He wrote slowly, never looking up, while water ran from her sleeves and pooled at her feet. The yard smelled of wet wool, horse heat, lamp oil, and stale ale poured into sawdust. Patricia moved from one merchant door to the next, each parcel accounted for, each receipt folded and hidden in the inner pocket. She had stitched herself into the lining of her bodice. She had become exact, because error cost more than money. If a ribbon went missing, it was deducted from her labour. If a date was copied wrong, she paid in meals. If a customer complained that she looked untidy, Lady Eriksson spoke of gratitude and providence, and then struck with words careful enough to leave no mark where visitors might see. Patricia had learned to stand very still during those speeches, and to answer with one sentence only. Yes, Lady Ericsson. She had once spoken too. The second had earned her 3 nights in the attic without a fire. The attic had been the nursery when her father still lived. She remembered the wallpaper roses, now stripped. She remembered her mother's pianoforte in the drawing-room below, now sold and replaced by a tall mirror that reflected only Lady Ericsson and her daughters at useful angles. The house itself had been renamed within a year of the funeral, as if a different brass plate by the gate could alter what the walls had heard. Patricia carried that knowledge the way she carried the parcels, close, quiet, heavy. She did not have the luxury of fury in public streets. She had tasks, 4 deliveries before noon, 2 ledger copies promised at dusk in exchange for 6pence from a printer on Stonegate who had discovered her hand was steady and her spelling exact. The 6pence would buy lamp oil and perhaps apples if she bargained at day's end. Literacy had become her hidden wage, the one skill no one in that household had managed to confiscate, though they had tried to reduce it to utility by setting her to inventories and unpaid correspondence. It remained her private proof that she had once been loved by a father who sat her on his knee and made letters into worlds. Near noon, the rain strengthened again, drumming on the wooden awnings and lifting the sharp scent of soaked rope. Patricia paused under the edge of a cooper's overhang long enough to re-wrap the shawl around the last 2 parcels. Her stomach cramped once, then settled. She pressed her palm against it and counted to 10. Across the yard, a line of travellers waited for horses, collars turned up, impatience visible in every posture. One young officer, boots polished bright despite the weather, watched her adjust the bundles and then stepped forward half a pace, as if he meant to offer help, before an older man at his side touched his sleeve and shook his head once. The officer stopped. Rank corrected impulse with the efficiency of a whip crack. Patricia looked down at the mud and resumed walking. She had seen that gesture before. Not here, not in this yard, but in drawing rooms where guests recognised her features from older portraits, and then accepted the present arrangement because comfort preferred simple stories. She was the dependent relation, the burden, the plain one useful for errands. It did not matter that her shoulders were narrow from want, or that her eyes carried the exhausted focus of someone counting every coin before it existed. In public, she had become a cautionary shape, proof that security was fragile and therefore to be ignored. A child darted in front of her chasing a hoop, slipped, and nearly fell beneath a carriage wheel. Patricia dropped 1 parcel into the mud and caught him by the collar, pulling him back so quickly her own knee struck stone. The child stared, startled, then ran toward a nurse who scolded him without noticing who had steadied him. Patricia lifted the parcel, wiped the paper clean with the driest corner of her shawl, and checked the seal. Unbroken. Good. Her knee throbbed. She stood and walked on. When the final receipt was signed, the bells from St. Martin's carried over the rain in thin bronze strokes. Patricia tucked the papers close to her ribs and turned towards Stonegate, where the lending library would take back 2 ledgers she had borrowed, against a promise of careful hands and punctual return. The street narrowed, cobbles shining like river stones. Shop windows glowed with warm wax light she could not afford to step into. A pastry cart passed, and the smell of butter made her mouth flood painfully before she mastered it. She withdrew the crust from her sleeve and ate half while walking, small bites timed between puddles and passing wheels. The bread was hard enough to scrape her palate. It felt like feast. Her cough rose again and she pressed her fist to her lips until it broke into a single sound she disguised as a throat clear. No one looked. That, more than the cold, more than the hunger, pressed hardest against her chest. The discipline of invisibility performed in crowded places. She reached the library door with water dripping from her hem and from the ends of her hair, with fingers stiff around the ledger straps, with mud drying in a thin crust over her boots. She paused beneath the lintel one brief moment, gathering breath, composing face, preparing to step inside where silence had rules, and even the poor were expected to move without noise. Then she lifted her hand to the latch and entered. Warmth met her first, then the smell of paste glue, damp wool, old calf skin, and coal that had burned low in the grate. The lending library on Stonegate was narrow and deep, shelves rising to a gallery rail where a ladder stood like a waiting spine. Rain tapped the front panes in quick silver strokes. Inside, pages turned, pens scratched, and the clerk behind the high desk sanded an entry line without haste. Patricia closed the door gently so the latch did not click too loud, then stood still while water gathered at her hem and dropped in a small, dark ring on the mat. She removed her shawl one careful fold at a time and drew out the 2 ledgers she had wrapped against the rain. The straps were wet but intact, no swelling at the corners, no loosened stitching. She checked by touch because touch had become more reliable than hope. Mr. Fenwick, thin as a quill and twice as exacting, looked up over his spectacles, saw who stood at his desk, and gave the smallest nod toward the side table, reserved for returns. No smile, no contempt, merely procedure. She preferred that to pity. She crossed to the table with her knee still tender from the yard, and laid both volumes on the green baize, spine to edge as the rules required. Her fingers left faint, damp marks on the cloth. She wiped them at once with her handkerchief, embarrassed by moisture as though rain itself were a breach of manners. The room held 3 subscribers at the rear tables, a curate copying notes from a sermon anthology, a widow in grey with a brass lorgnette, and a draper's son preparing account columns in a hand too large for margins. None of them spoke, yet Patricia felt their attention skim her patched cuffs and pause at the mud line on her skirt before retreating to safer objects. She had grown used to that silent arithmetic. If her dress had been finer, they would have asked her family. If her gloves had not been mended at each thumb, they might have asked her opinion on the weather. Poverty reduced language. Titles survived it. She set her borrowing card beside the ledgers and waited for inspection, heart beating hard for a reason that would have looked absurd to anyone with regular meals. A late return fee was 2 pence. A water stain assessed as neglect was 3. Loss of borrowing privileges would cost far more than either. The books were not leisure. They were tools. Tables of grain prices, freight schedules, legal forms, sermon indexes, shipping notices from Hull, printers' specimens of type and ornament. Information translated into coin after midnight when the house slept. As she waited, she looked past Mr. Fenwick's shoulder to the locked cabinet where private collections sat behind leaded glass, and she remembered her father standing in that same room years ago, broad hands warm against her shoulders, saying that a ledger did not merely count goods, but revealed character because every line declared what a person believed could be measured and what they preferred to hide. He had said it in winter, on a day when sleet struck the windows and she had been 12 and restless, and determined to prove she could add columns faster than any apprentice. He had laughed and set a copper farthing by her elbow for every page she balanced without correction, pretending it was business while watching her with unguarded pride. Those afternoons had vanished first, long before the silver, long before the horses, before the first bailiff's letter arrived with red wax and language so courteous it almost concealed ruin. Her father, Anders Eriksson, had signed security for a shipping partner whose warehouses burned near the Ouse in a night wind that carried sparks half across the district. The partner had wept in their drawing room and spoken of temporary strain and honourable intentions. Within 6 months, he was gone to the continent. The creditors remained, punctual as church bells. Anders paid what he could, sold timber rights, dismissed half the household, and worked through fever because men who considered themselves useful often mistook exhaustion for duty. By the first week of April in the year she turned 17, he coughed blood into a folded napkin and called it nothing. He continued through 2 auctions and 1 court petition. The doctor prescribed rest with the grave authority of men who never had to meet collectors at the front door. Rest did not arrive. The fever deepened. The final week he asked for account books at dawn and could no longer hold the pen by dusk. Patricia remembered the weight of his wrist in her palm, the heat of his skin, the stubborn way his mouth shaped each number as she wrote to dictation. She remembered him breaking off mid-line, eyes closed, breath thin, and then forcing one more instruction in a voice scraped raw. "Do not let them tell you ignorance is feminine." He died before morning prayers, the house filled with black crape and polite men speaking in lowered tones about liabilities. Lady Ericsson, then newly widowed in public and newly vigilant in private, cried with precision in the front rooms and summoned solicitors to the study before the lilies from the funeral had begun to brown. Grief in that house took the shape of ledgers, seals, signatures, and lock changes. Patricia stood at the nursery window in borrowed mourning and watched a workman unscrew the old gate plate that bore her father's initials. By evening a new plate gleamed there, polished, impersonal, correct. No one asked her whether memory consented. The second marriage came faster than any decent sorrow. A year and 3 weeks after the funeral, Lady Ericsson wore dove silk at breakfast and announced that Providence had favoured prudence. The gentleman she had chosen owned mills north of Leeds and preferred to remain there. His money preferred to remain with her. She kept the Ericsson name for the house because the line still carried weight in York trade circles, and she kept Patricia because removing her at once would have looked indecorous. Decorum was always the first mask. Behind it, reductions began with relentless order. The blue drawing room was shut. Then the morning room. Then the west stair, except on receiving days. Portraits of Patricia's mother were moved to storage for dust preservation, then never seen again. Her mother's jewel case, once locked in the escritoire, appeared around the wrists and throats of Rosamond and Eliza, Lady Ericsson's daughters by her first husband, as if inheritance were merely a question of who reached first. They had pale ringlets, soft hands, and the practised languor of girls taught that boredom was distinction. They took Patricia's place, at table, without embarrassment, laughing over syllabub, while she stood behind Lady Ericsson's chair to pour chocolate she could not taste. When guests asked why Miss Ericsson did not sit, Lady Ericsson answered with rose-water civility that Patricia was improving her usefulness. The phrase became policy. Breakfast trays bypassed the attic, unless she had completed the previous evening's mending quota. Her old room on the second floor was reassigned to Rosamond's gowns, and Patricia was moved under the eaves where winter wind found every crack and summer heat held through midnight. She was given a narrow bed, 1 blanket, a washstand with a chipped basin, and a candle ration measured to the inch. Accounts followed cruelty with legal polish. Her father's will had left her a modest dowry in trust. Within months it had diminished under executor fees, debt transfer adjustments, valuation costs, emergency repairs, and one disputed bond attached to obligations she had never seen. Each explanation arrived in folded paper, dense with clauses. Each paper ended with the same verdict: insufficient remainder. When she asked to review the originals, Lady Erikson smiled, as if indulging childish play, and said, "Women who insist on numbers grow old before they are asked to dance." The words were delivered over breakfast, while Eliza selected apricot preserves and Rosamond practised an aria in a voice like polished tin. Later that day, Lady Erikson inspected Patricia's hands, found soap cracks at the knuckles, and ordered her to polish silver until the marks softened enough not to offend visitors. When Patricia coughed, supper disappeared. When she stumbled from fatigue, tasks doubled. Once, in the small withdrawing room, Lady Erikson struck her with a fan across the wrist for answering too quickly in front of callers. The bruise faded in 4 days. The lesson remained. Yet, even under that regime, there were corners of resistance too small to attract notice. Patricia rose before dawn to copy invoices in the still hour when fires were only embers and no one called her name. She learned the house rhythms better than any bell. When Lady Erikson prayed for appearances, when Rosamond rehearsed scales, when Eliza spent 40 minutes choosing ribbon while servants waited with pins in their mouths. In those intervals, Patricia sold her skill quietly. A printer on Stonegate paid 6pence for clean transcript pages without blotting. A curate paid 3 for fair copies of sermons when his own hand cramped. The apothecary's widow paid in bread, and once, in quinine bark for labelling jars in Latin, she could sound out but not claim to know. Patricia stored coins in a hem pocket stitched beneath her petticoat, and kept a list of every shilling hidden under the loose board beside her bed. She also kept a second list, never written, of what had been taken: her mother's pearls, her father's signet, her own place at table, the right to tire without penalty, the ordinary dignity of being addressed by her Christian name in her own home. By Michaelmas of last year, Lady Erikson had begun to speak of Patricia as if she were an account deficit to be closed before winter. This week the threat had sharpened into date and consequence. Secure paid employment by month's end, or leave the house with no character reference, no trunk, and no claim on remaining property. The command had been delivered in the front hall beneath the portrait of Anders Erikson, that still hung there because removing it would have drawn comment from men who remembered him. Lady Erikson had stood in plum silk that whispered at every movement, rose water trailing in the air. Rosamond and Eliza watched from the stair, amused and careful not to appear so. Patricia had answered as she always answered in that house, voice even, hands still. "Yes, Lady Erikson," while her stomach turned and her vision narrowed at the edges. Now she stood in the Stonegate lending library with rainwater drying on her cuffs, waiting for Mr. Fenwick's verdict on 2 borrowed ledgers she could not afford to lose, knowing that her future had already been reduced to measurable units. Days remaining, pence owed, lines copied, meals withheld, doors that might open if she kept her spine straight long enough. Mr. Fenwick turned the first ledger, checked the spine, then the second, and marked her card with a precise stroke. "Returned in sound condition, Miss Erikson," he said, sliding it back toward her. "You may take 1 volume today, under the same terms." Patricia drew a careful breath, tucked the card into her sleeve, and reached for the shelf labelled Household Accounts, as if the act itself were a vow. Her fingers had just brushed the worn spine of Household Accounts 1818 to 1822, when the front door struck its stopper with a hard report, and a gust of rain-cooled air swept the room. Candle flames bent. Loose slips on Mr. Fenwick's desk lifted and skated. The draper's son swore under his breath and clamped his pages flat. Patricia turned with the others, one hand still raised toward the shelf, and saw a man fill the threshold as if he had brought the weather in with him. He was tall enough that the lintel looked low, Water tracked from the brim of his hat to the shoulders of a black travelling coat, cut too fine for the mud on its hem. His gloves were dark and wet. His jaw was clean-shaven and severe, the mouth set as if words were tools to be spent sparingly. He removed his hat not hurriedly, and a lock of dark hair fell forward before he pushed it back with an impatient motion. Something in the room altered at once, not because he raised his voice, but because everyone else grew careful. Mr. Fenwick straightened to full height behind his desk. The widow with the lorgnette lowered it and looked down into her lap. The curate rose as though by reflex and then sat again when no one invited him to stand. Patricia understood rank before she understood face. She saw the quality of wool, the shine of a signet on his right hand, the plainness of mourning black worn by men who did not need ornament to be obeyed. She also saw what did not fit. He carried under his arm a weathered volume bound in cracked brown leather, edges rubbed pale by many hands, a book that belonged in a nursery chest or a parish vestry, not in the grasp of a man who arrived with a crest-buttoned coach waiting in rain. He stepped in, shut the door himself, and crossed the floor with measured strides that made no haste and wasted no movement. His boots struck once on the stone by the returns table. Then he stopped directly behind her shoulder, close enough that she felt the residual cold from his coat and the heat of his body beneath it. When he spoke, his voice was deep and level, carrying to the back shelves without effort. "I came to return your book." She turned too fast. The room tipped. Hunger and damp and a day of walking made her balance treacherous, and she caught the edge of the shelf with her raw fingers before she fell. Pain flared at her knuckles. She steadied herself and faced him. Up close he looked carved from winter, dark brows, eyes the colour of rough water before a storm, a scar pale against one temple disappearing into his hairline. There was nothing soft in him except exhaustion, and even that wore discipline. She had seen him only once at a distance, riding past their gate with 2 grooms and a silence that made men step aside. Duke Alaric Vale of Ravensmere. Everyone in York knew the name. He held out the book between them, not offering, not pleading, simply presenting fact like a blade laid flat across a table. The leather cover bore an impressed crest she did not recognise, a raven above a crossed key and branch. Rain had darkened the corners. The clasp hung broken. "My lord," Patricia said, because her mouth remembered forms even while her pulse hammered at her throat. "That is not mine." His gaze did not leave her face. "Look at it." She should have lowered her eyes. She should have stepped back and yielded space. Instead, she stood in her mud-marked skirt, with wet hair clinging to her neck, one boot leaking, and met a duke's stare because confusion outran caution. "I have never seen it." "Read the flyleaf." The command landed as cleanly as a dropped weight. Mr. Fenwick made a faint sound behind them, half deference, half warning, but did not intervene. Patricia could feel every gaze in the room on her patched cuffs. Heat rose under her skin, despite the chill in her stockings. Public rooms had taught her to become smaller. This man, without touching her, refused her that refuge. She heard the rain outside, hard against pane glass. She heard her own breath, too quick. She heard, impossibly clear, the soft scrape as his thumb moved once along the cracked spine, almost protective. "It is not proper," she said quietly, "for me to take what belongs to your grace." His expression didn't change. "Take the book." It was the tone men used with gates and horses, yet there was no contempt in it. There was urgency, contained and sharp, and something like anger that did not seem aimed at her. Patricia took the volume because refusal in that room would become spectacle. and spectacle in her life always found its way back to Lady Ericson's hand. The leather was damp and warm from his grip. She set it on the returns table, aware of her trembling fingers, and lifted the cover. The first page crackled. An old scent rose from the paper. Dust and beeswax and faint lavender long faded. At the top, in a hand she did not know, was written, "For TV, for winter nights." Below it, in darker ink, later, tighter, were initials and shorthand marks that made her chest constrict. A E. She stared. Her father's hand had never been elegant. It leaned forward as if the words themselves were hurrying to catch a train. He crossed his sevens with a hard slash. He marked numbers in the margin with a tiny hooked stroke that no copy clerk used, because no copy clerk had learned sums at his table while he tapped rhythms with a spoon and called mistakes by affectionate names. The same hooked stroke sat there now beside a line from a children's hymn. She forgot the room. She forgot rank. She heard the winter nursery in her memory, her father's voice rough from laughter, singing badly on purpose until she protested and corrected him. Her hand moved to the margin before she knew she had reached. Ink stains on her fingertips, never quite scrubbed clean, met old ink laid down years ago. "That hand," she said, and her own voice sounded strange to her, thinned by shock. "That hand is my father's." Silence held for one beat, then two. Duke Vale watched her without blinking. "I know." The words struck harder than if he had raised his voice. Patricia looked up. "How could you know?" He inclined his head toward the page. "Because I have read the same marks for 6 nights, and because Anders Ericsson signed 3 freight contracts for Ravensmere with that same cursed flourish under every figure." A muscle moved once along his jaw. "Your father corrected my steward's arithmetic when I was 20, and insufferable. He did not fear titles. He feared bad numbers." Mr. Fenwick inhaled sharply, startled by the familiarity in the Duke's tone and the use of her father's Christian name unsoftened by distance. Patricia's throat tightened. No one in her present life spoke of Anders Ericsson as if he had been a living man. In Lady Ericsson's drawing room, he had become an inconvenience wrapped in framed oils. Here, in this narrow room with rain needling the panes, a duke had spoken of him in the present tense of memory. She tried to hand the book back, instinctive retreat from the cliff edge of feeling. "Then it belongs to your grace." He didn't take it. "No." "My lord—" "No!" His gaze dropped briefly to her hands, to the cracked knuckles and the small white scar along her thumb where a kitchen knife had slipped last winter, then to the inside of her wrist where yesterday's bruise showed above the cuff despite her care. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but each word landed with brutal precision. "You are ink-stained at both fingers. You copy for pay. You hide your right wrist when spoken to. You have a fresh mark there shaped like a thumb. Do not tell me this room is the first place anyone has asked too much of you." Colour drained from her face. The bruise burned as if named into existence. She pulled her sleeve down. "You presume a great deal." "I observe a great deal." "You do not know me?" "Then speak and be known." The widow at the back table gathered her gloves and rose, clearly intending to leave and equally clearly unwilling to pass between them. She paused by the catalogue stand until Mr. Fenwick, flustered, hurried around the desk and escorted her by the side aisle. The curate bent low over his notes with theatrical absorption. The draper's son had stopped writing entirely. Patricia hated that they were witness. She hated the heat in her cheeks and the tremor in her left hand she could not still. She set her palm flat on the book to steady both. "My lord, if you have business with Mr. Fenwick, I will remove myself." "Stop!" The command froze her where she stood. He took one step nearer, enough that she could see rain caught in his lashes, enough that the scent of wet wool and cold iron reached her. Read the margin aloud. I cannot. You can. I will not perform for a room full of strangers. For the first time a flicker crossed his face, not anger, not amusement, recognition. Good, he said, almost under his breath, as if she had passed an unseen measure. Then, louder, Mr. Fenwick, clear the room. The clerk looked as though he had been asked to move a chapel. Your Grace, with respect, these are subscribers. Clear it. No one argued with that tone. The curate stood, gathering papers with clumsy speed. The draper's son stuffed his ledger into his satchel, eyes lowered. The widow was already at the door. In less than a minute, only Mr. Fenwick remained, hovering by the desk with all the misery of a man torn between policy and survival. You as well, Vale said, without looking at him. Mr. Fenwick hesitated. His glance flicked to Patricia. Apology and alarm mixed in equal measure. She gave the smallest nod she could manage. He swallowed. Very good, Your Grace. He stepped out, closing the inner door behind him, until only the rain and the fire's faint hiss remained. Patricia stood alone with the Duke in an emptied library, and felt the full weight of her circumstances settle like a chain. If Lady Ericsson heard of this, she would call it ruin regardless of truth. If she fled now, she would lose the only place she could borrow the tools that kept her fed. If she stayed, she stepped further into a conversation she had not chosen. Her pulse beat hard in her ears. She lifted her chin because dignity was sometimes nothing more than posture held under pressure. This is coercion, she said. His answer came at once. No, it is urgency. For whom? His mouth tightened. For my son. The words changed the room, not softened, sharpened. Patricia had heard gossip in fragments. The Duchess of Ravensmere dead 3 winters now, a boy at the estate who did not speak, nurses dismissed one after another, a household run with military order and no music after dusk. She had never expected to stand inside that rumour and be addressed as if she might matter to it. I am not a nurse, she said. I did not ask if you were. Then what are you asking? He placed one gloved finger on the hymn-line in the margin, on her father's hooked mark. Read this page exactly as he marked it. She looked from the ink to his face and saw, beneath command, strain held by force. His shoulders were rigid. His hands were still in a way that suggested effort, not calm. A man used to controlling rooms had brought a private book through rain to a public library and emptied the room for a stranger in a patched dress. Whatever power he carried, it had not spared him need. Her voice, when it came, was low but steady. If I read, you will answer one question truthfully. He did not hesitate. Name it. Why did you say it was my book? He held her gaze. Because it was left for an Ericsson daughter, and there is only one in York who still reads as if words are bread. The fire settled with a soft collapse. Rain struck the panes in relentless silver lines. Patricia lowered her eyes to the page, set her fingertip beside her father's cipher, and began to read. Rock of ages cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee, Patricia read, her voice barely above the rain. The words were familiar in the way hunger was familiar, not chosen, endured, and therefore known in the bones. She followed her father's hooked marks in the margin, pausing where he had cut the line into measured breaths, lifting slightly where he had drawn a small upward stroke beside a syllable. The page trembled once under her fingertip, and then steadied. She reached the end of the first verse and stopped. Duke Vale did not move. His gaze stayed on the book. Again. She read it a second time, slower. The library held its breath around them. Fire settled in the grate with a soft shift. Rain went on, striking the panes in thin, hard threads. At the third line she heard it, faint at first, a quick, uneven sound beyond the inner door. Not footsteps. Breathing. A child's breathing dragged too fast through a narrowed throat. Vale heard it in the same instant. His head turned sharply toward the corridor. The stillness in him broke, not into panic, but into action stripped to command. He crossed to the door and opened it before the second rough breath sounded. A footman stood outside, soaked to the collar despite the covered walk, hat in both hands, face ashen. Behind him a nursemaid in grey held a boy against her shoulder. The child looked 6 or 7, slight under a velvet coat cut with excessive care, dark hair damp at the temples, one gloved hand clenched against his chest. His eyes were wide and unfocused. He was making no cry, only that ragged, soundless effort to pull air deep enough. "Your Grace," the footman said, breathless. He would not remain in the carriage. He saw the storm glass break, and then Vale's reply was one word: "Inside!" The nursemaid hesitated at the threshold when she saw Patricia standing by the table in her plain wet dress. Her look carried quick contempt, then fear, then calculation. Vale did not grant her time for any of it. "Now!" She entered. The boy twisted hard in her arms, trying to turn away from everyone and no one. His right glove had darkened at the palm. Blood had seeped through the kid leather in a thin crescent where he had squeezed something sharp. Patricia put the hymn book down and moved before she had weighed cost. "My lord," she said quietly, already stepping closer. "He is cutting his hand with his own grip," the nursemaid snapped. "Do not touch him." Vale's eyes stayed on his son. "Miss Eriksson will speak. You will obey." The words landed like iron. The nursemaid fell silent, shaken more by the Duke's tone than by the content. Patricia came to the boy's level and knelt on the stone floor. Her knees protested at once. She ignored them. Up close she could see the child's lashes clumped with damp, his lips paling at the edges, his chest lifting high and shallow. Panic had locked him high in his breath. He could not drop it low enough to settle. She held out her empty hands where he could see them. "You are safe," she said, not because she believed safety was simple, but because the child needed one true sentence he could borrow. "I will not force your hand open. I will wait." He did not look at her, not look at Auntie. His gaze flicked toward the window where rain ran in racing lines, then to the grate, then to his father's boots, then away again. His shoulders were rigid as drawn wire. Patricia lowered herself further until she sat back on her heels. Wet from her hem, spread into her stockings. "My lord, has he spoken since this began?" Vale answered without delay. "No." "Has singing ever worsened it?" "No, nothing alters it." Nothing. The word carried years. Patricia felt it pass through her and set itself beside her own private inventory of endured things. She turned back to the boy. "May I remove your glove?" He made a small, hard sound in his throat, refusal by instinct, but his fingers did not tighten further. She took that as permission and slid one fingertip beneath the cuff. The leather stuck where blood had dried. She worked slowly, one breath at a time, easing it free without pulling at the palm. When the glove came away, a narrow cut showed across the heel of his hand, not deep but messy from pressure. A shard of green glass lay embedded against his skin, where he had gripped and would not release. She saw then what the footman had said. Storm glass from the carriage lamp. He had clutched the broken piece and held on as if pain in the hand were easier than terror in the chest. "Water," Patricia said. The nursemaid looked to Vale, uncertain. He did not take his eyes from the boy. "Bring it!" She hurried to the side basin. Patricia set both palms on the floor, grounding herself. "Look at me," she said softly to the child, "only for a moment." His gaze slid past her. She reached for the hymn book with one hand and opened to the marked page. "You know this, perhaps? If not, we shall borrow the rhythm anyway. You need not sing. You only need to listen." No response. No assent. The boy's breathing stayed high and frantic. Patricia began to read exactly as her father had marked it, each phrase measured to force a lower breath. "Let the water and the blood." She paused, counting in silence with the hooked marks. "From thy wounded side which flowed." Pause. "Be of sin, the double cure." Pause. "Save from wrath and make me pure." The boy's next inhale snagged, then dropped a fraction lower. Not calm, less catastrophic. She repeated the lines slower still, allowing the words to act as metronome rather than meaning. On the third repetition, his eyes found her mouth and stayed there, tracking shape and pause. His left hand, still gloved, loosened against his coat. By the time the Minster clock struck 1/4 after noon, she had read the stanza 6 times. Her own throat had gone dry. The child's breaths were still quick, but now they reached deeper. His shoulders no longer climbed to his ears. The nursemaid returned with water and clean linen, hands shaking enough to spill. Patricia took both and set the bowl near her knee. "Thank you," she said, because gratitude could steady the unsteady. Then she looked up at Vale. "I must remove the glass. He will resist when it hurts. You may hold his forearm, not his chest." Vale crouched at once, long body folding with military precision beside his son. He held the child's forearm exactly as instructed, firm and immovable. The boy jerked once, saw his father's hand, and went rigid again. Patricia leaned in. "One breath with me," she whispered. "Then one more. Then we are done." She counted from the margin marks. On the second count, she used the corner of the linen to lift the shard free. It came out clean. Fresh blood welled bright and immediate. The boy flinched hard, a silent cry opening his mouth. Patricia pressed folded linen to the cut before he could fold his hand shut again. "Good," she murmured. "Good. It stings, and that is all." She rapped once, twice, binding the palm with careful pressure. The strip of linen was too short for a secure tie. Without thinking, she reached to the inner seam of her skirt, where the lining still held one unfrayed edge, and tore a narrow length free. The sound was small but final. Her only decent dress would hang uneven from this day forward. She did not pause to regret it. She laid the strip over the first bandage and knotted it beneath the boy's wrist, where it would not rub. Vale watched every movement. His face gave nothing. His hands gave truth. They were steady on command. They trembled when still. When the bandage was set, Patricia kept her hand beneath the boy's bandaged one, so he felt support without restraint. She resumed the hymn, softer now, not reading but singing under her breath in the plain nursery line her father had mocked and taught, and finally learned for her sake. The child's lashes lowered, his breathing slowed by degrees that would have looked like no change to any impatient eye. To Patricia, who had spent years measuring survival in fractions, the change was vast. The nursemaid whispered, "He does not permit strangers near him." Patricia did not look up. "He has permitted me because no one asked him to perform obedience." Vale's gaze flicked to her face at that. "Is that accusation?" "It is a fact." His mouth tightened. "Continue." So she did. Verse into verse, each one carried on the same measured cadence. The boy's head tipped forward until his brow rested against her forearm. He was not asleep. He was listening with the fierce concentration of the recently terrified. His left hand found the edge of her sleeve and held it in his fist, as if anchoring himself to cloth was safer than anchoring to people. Patricia kept singing until the tremor left his shoulders entirely. When silence finally settled, It did not feel empty. It felt earned. She eased the hymn book closed and looked to Vale. He should have warm broth and no questions for 1 hour. If he has another attack, reduce sound first. Commands after. The nursemaid stiffened at being instructed by a mud-splashed woman kneeling on library stone. Vale spoke before she could object. You heard Miss Eriksson. Yes, Your Grace. Patricia started to rise and her knee failed under her from cold and strain. She caught herself with a hand on the floor. Vale moved instantly, one hand at her elbow, not gentle, not rough, simply present and undeniable. He lifted her to standing, as if she weighed no more than a coat. Steady, he said. She withdrew her arm as soon as balance returned. I am steady. His eyes dropped to the torn inner seam of her skirt, where the lining now hung ragged. You tore your only serviceable hem. It was cloth. It was what you had. She met his gaze. He needed it first. Something shifted across his face so slight another woman might have missed it. Not warmth, not yet. Recognition sharpened into regard. He turned to the footman at the door. Fetch my carriage physician from Dunley Street. Tell him to meet us at Ravensmere within the hour, and to bring laudanum only as reserve, not first remedy. The footman bowed and ran. Vale then faced Patricia again. You will write instructions for the household, exact quantities, exact intervals. She almost laughed at the audacity of being commanded into usefulness by a duke while her boots leaked on his library floor. She did not laugh. I'm not in your household. You are in this room. That is not the same matter. Right. She should have refused out of prudence. She should have remembered Lady Eriksson's ultimatum, the danger of being seen in private conference, the cost of one rumour multiplied by a hostile mouth. Instead, she crossed to Mr. Fenwick's desk, took the offered sheet from the stunned clerk who had reappeared in the corridor, and wrote in a fast, clean hand, while the ink was still thick from morning grind. Breathing protocol, wound-washing steps, night terrors to be met with low light and a repetitive line, not restraint. She added at the bottom, in smaller script, ask consent in plain language whenever possible. Panic worsens under forced handling. She sanded the sheet and handed it to Vale. He read once, folded it, placed it inside his coat without comment. The boy, now in the nursemaid's arms, leaned toward Patricia and tightened his grip on her sleeve. His lips parted. No sound came. He looked frustrated by his own silence, then pressed 2 fingers against the bandage and held them up as if showing her he understood what had been done. She touched those fingers lightly. Yes, keep it dry. He gave one short nod and let go. Vale's voice came from above her shoulder. His name is Elias. She turned. Thank you for telling me. He has not accepted a tutor. He has dismissed 4 nurses by refusing all food in their care. Children are not regiments, Your Grace. Do not lecture me about my son. Then do not command me as though competence were insolence. For one dangerous second the old pattern asserted itself. Power, correction, punishment. Patricia braced for the verbal strike she knew too well. It did not come. Vale stood absolutely still, eyes on hers, then inclined his head by a fraction that felt more intimate than apology. Very well, he said. State your terms. The words caught her off guard because they acknowledged choice, where she had expected only pressure. She glanced at Elias, now calmer, cheek against the nursemaid's shoulder, bandaged hand resting open at last. Her own stomach cramped again with hunger. Her dress clung damp to her legs. Rain continued its relentless tapping along the windows as if time itself refused to soften for anyone. My term is simple, she said. The child is not to be used as proof of anyone's obedience. Not mine, not his. Vale answered at once, "Agreed." She held his gaze another beat, testing for evasion. She found none, only exhaustion, authority, and a kind of disciplined grief she did not yet know how to name. Mr. Fenwick hovered by the returns table, pretending to reorder slips while listening to every syllable. Patricia became suddenly aware of the room again, of witness, of consequence waiting in every corridor of York. Lady Ericsson would hear something by evening. She always did. Patricia gathered the hymn book and placed it between them. "Your son should go now while he is settled." Vale did not take the volume. "Keep it until tomorrow." "My lord, I cannot carry ducal property through Stonegate without comment." "You carried my son through panic without comment." "That was necessity." "So is this." He placed his gloved hand flat over the cover, then lifted it, leaving the book where it lay before her, as if the gesture itself transferred burden. "Read the marked pages tonight. Bring me the pattern in your own hand at first light." She felt the old reflex to refuse any demand formed as command. She also felt Elias's fingers clutching her sleeve, the way his breathing had matched the hymn by the 6th repetition, the way Vale had obeyed when told where to place his hand. Trade-offs, risk against utility, fear against the chance to do one thing exactly right. She took the book. "I will return it at first light," she said. Vale looked at the torn seam, the damp hem, the raw knuckles, and then at her face with that same unflinching attention that had first felt like invasion and now felt perilously close to being seen. "Do not return hungry," he said. "You shake when you stand still." Her spine went rigid. "That is not your concern." "It is now." The nursemaid shifted Elias toward the door. The footman opened it. Cold air slid in, smelling of rain and horse and the iron tang of wet street. Vale stepped back to allow Patricia passage first, an old courtesy performed with soldierly efficiency, almost as if he did not trust himself to stand nearer another second. At the threshold he spoke once more, low enough that only she heard. "Miss Ericsson, do not let Lady Ericsson see that book." Patricia's hand tightened on the worn leather. "I had no intention of doing so," she said, and walked out into the rain with the hymn against her ribs and the taste of unswallowed fear sharp at the back of her throat. Rain hit her face like thrown pins the instant she crossed the library threshold. Stonegate was crowded despite the weather. Wheels hissed over wet cobbles. A butcher's boy ran past with a covered tray balanced on his shoulder. Two ladies under a striped umbrella paused when they saw the book clutched under Patricia's shawl, then moved on with the practised indifference of women who understood that looking too long could be mistaken for sympathy. Patricia kept walking. The hymn book was heavier than its size allowed. The leather had warmed in her hands inside, but rain chilled it through at once. She tucked it tighter against her ribs and turned toward the narrow lane that would take her to the printer first, then home by the servants' gate where questions were fewer. Her knee jarred in the posting yard, gave a dull warning at each step. Her left boot took water again. Hunger rose and dropped in a single hard wave that left her briefly light-headed. She did not stop. Behind her, carriage doors opened and shut. A footman called for room. Harness jingled. She heard Duke Vale's voice, once low and clipped, too indistinct for words. She did not turn to look. Looking back felt dangerous. So did not looking back. She chose forward and reached the shelter of an apothecary's recessed doorway, just long enough to shift the shawl and catch one breath that did not scrape. The breath failed halfway. A cough broke free, then another. She bent, one hand braced against wet brick, shoulders tight as she fought to quiet the sound. If she arrived home coughing, supper would vanish. If she arrived coughing and carrying a ducal book, much worse could follow. "Stop!" The command came close, not loud. It cut through the rain as if it belonged to a quieter room. Patricia straightened too quickly and pressed her fist to her mouth. Duke Vale stood one step away, hat back on, rain darkening his coat to near black. He had no umbrella. Water ran from his hair at the temples. Behind him at the curb, his carriage waited, with one door open. Through the rain-blurred glass, she could see Elias inside, small and still, bandaged hand resting on the window ledge. "I am not in your service, Your Grace," she said, voice roughened by the cough. "You may not command me in a public street." His gaze moved over her face, down to the hand at her mouth, then to the shake in her shoulders she had not managed to hide. "You are coughing bloodless and hollow. You are shivering through wet wool. You are carrying a book that can have you searched before nightfall." He paused. "So I am commanding the weather and your pride together. Stand still for 1 minute." The words should have stung. They did. They also steadied her in spite of herself. She kept her chin level. "Your son needs you. My son is breathing." His jaw tightened once. "You are one collapse from the gutter stones." Humiliation burned hotter than cold. "I have walked those stones for years. They have not claimed me yet." He looked at her with that same infuriating precision, as if every sentence she offered was being weighed for hidden fractures. "Yet." A footman approached with a dark wool umbrella and a wrapped parcel of something under oilcloth. Vale did not take the umbrella. He took the parcel and held it out. "Eat!" Patricia stared at the offered bundle. Rain ran off its edges. "No, eat! I will not take alms." "It is not alms." His voice stayed flat. "It is wages in advance for work you already agreed to perform." "I agreed to copy a breathing pattern." "You agreed to return at first light with your hand on it. That is work." She should have refused again. Pride asked for refusal. So did fear, but the smell escaping the oilcloth was plain broth and bread, and her stomach tightened so hard it made her vision pulse. "I can pay it back," she said quietly. "You will." He glanced toward the carriage window. Elias had shifted closer, watching with grave concentration. "By coming tomorrow, fed enough to stand." Patricia took the parcel because refusing in front of the child would teach the wrong lesson to someone who had just learned to loosen his fist. She tucked it beneath her shawl beside the book. 2 burdens now, one warm, one cold. "Thank you," she said, each syllable formal as a debt note. Vale gave one short nod, then turned towards the carriage and lifted 2 fingers. The footman closed the door. Another climbed to the box. The carriage did not move. Patricia waited for him to follow it. He did not. Rain ran down his collar. He stood in the street as if rooted there, broad-shouldered and motionless, while his son's carriage remained at the curb by his signal. A brewer's wagon squeezed past, driver cursing at the blockage. Vale did not step aside until the wheel rim nearly brushed his boot. Only then did he shift, still facing Patricia. "Go with that carriage," he said. "You will be dropped at a safe address." "No." "Miss Erickson, no." She swallowed and forced steadiness back into her tone. "If I vanish from Lady Erickson's view before dusk, she will report me as absconded and accuse me of theft to protect herself. I must be seen returning by ordinary route." His eyes narrowed fractionally. "She has done this before." Patricia said nothing. Silence answered for her. He exhaled once through his nose, a contained sound of anger turned inward. "Then you will not walk alone." "That is not possible." "It is done." She frowned. "Done." "I sent a man to the magistrate's clerk from the library corridor," he said. "Your name and mine are both entered in his daybook as witnesses to Elias's seizure and treatment. Time noted. Place noted. If anyone claims you stole that volume before this hour, the claim contradicts sworn record." She stared at him, Rain forgotten for one startled beat. "You had no right to enter my name without consent." "I had no intention of leaving you unrecorded." The street noise seemed to pull back, muffled by rain and shock. He had acted while she knelt on stone, while she tied linen with shaking fingers. He had not announced it. He had simply done it. "That cannot be taken back," she said. "No!" He did not soften the admission. He wore it like an order executed. Patricia tightened her hold on the hymn book. Fear and relief struck together, a painful combination that made her throat constrict. "Do you understand what you have done to my position?" "Yes." The answer came immediately. "I changed it." A church bell sounded the half hour through damp air. People passed, glanced, and looked away faster than before. A duke standing bareheaded in rain to speak with a soaked woman in a mended shawl was not a scene York knew where to place. The resulting discomfort rippled around them like current around stone. Patricia lifted her chin another degree. "You make choices as if every door opens for your hand." His gaze dropped briefly to her wrist where the bruise hid under cloth, then returned to her eyes. "No, I make choices because doors close faster for yours." The sentence landed with dangerous force, not romantic, not tender, simply exact. She could not remember the last time anyone with power had named the mechanism instead of pretending it did not exist. She looked past him at Elias in the carriage. The child had pressed his bandaged palm to the window glass. His eyes were on her, intent and unsmiling, as if asking whether she would vanish now that his breathing had steadied. Patricia stepped toward the carriage and lifted her ungloved hand. Elias mirrored her, palm to glass, linen bright against the grey day. She gave him one measured nod. He held still, then touched 2 fingers to the bandage again, the same small signal from inside. Proof of understanding, proof of memory. When she turned back, Vale had not moved. "Why are you still here?" she asked, before caution could polish the question. A muscle shifted at his throat. "Because if I leave first, you will walk until you fall." "I have not fallen." "You nearly did in the doorway." "That was my knee." "And your hunger and the cough you think no one hears." She wanted to deny it. Denial had been useful for years. It failed under his gaze. She settled for deflection. "You watched too closely." "Yes." He did not apologize. Rain struck his shoulders in steady darkening lines. She drew a careful breath. "Your son needs certainty, not spectacle. Go with him." For the first time his eyes broke from hers, moving to the carriage where Elias waited. He remained still for a count of 3, 4, 5. Then he looked back, and what sat in his face was not indecision but calculation under strain, the ruthless balancing of 2 duties with no clean answer. He raised his hand to the driver. "Home," he called. "Slow pace, no jolting corners." The carriage pulled away into rain. Elias did not look from the window until the wheel spray and passing carts swallowed the view. Vale stayed where he was until the carriage vanished at the lane turn. Only then did he move back under the apothecary overhang with Patricia. Water dripped from his cuffs onto the stone between them. "You should have gone with him," she said quietly. "I know." "Then why did you not?" His expression flattened, the old ducal mask returning by increments. "Because I had one more order to give." She stiffened. "I have accepted enough orders for one day." "This one concerns your safety." He reached inside his coat and produced a folded card sealed in dark wax with the Vale crest. "If Lady Erickson attempts to confine you, strike you, or take that book, You send this to Magistrate Henshaw's office by any errand boy and say only that you request immediate review under my affidavit." Patricia did not take the card. "An affidavit of what?" "Of what I observed today." His voice hardened. "And of what I have observed before." Cold moved through her that had nothing to do with Rain. "Before? I have seen you turn from your own front step in January, while your stepsister's guests laughed from the hall. I have seen you walk to market at dawn with bare hands in frost, while your house-groom stood idle. I have seen a bruise shaped like fingers on your left arm at evensong, and watched Lady Ericsson call it clumsiness." Each sentence stripped another layer of the careful invisibility she had built to survive. She felt exposed, furious, and oddly less alone, all at once. "You were watching," she said. "I was noticing." His eyes did not leave hers. "No one wrote it down. I did." He held out the sealed card again. This time she took it. The wax was still warm. "Why?" The question escaped before she could soften it. "Why involve yourself in this?" He answered without pause. "Because my son breathed to your voice. Because your father once kept my house from ruin with a ledger and never sent a bill. Because I am tired of rooms where everyone sees and no one states what is in front of them." Rain beat harder against the awning edge, a solid grey curtain now. Patricia slipped the sealed card inside her bodice pocket beside the delivery receipts, the lawful and the dangerous sharing space over her heart. "What do you require in exchange?" she asked. He looked almost offended. "Competence at dawn. Honesty when you cannot do what I ask. Nothing else." The absence of hidden terms felt less believable than any bargain. She studied his face for mockery, for manoeuvre, found none. A hired hackney rattled past, empty. Vale lifted 2 fingers, and it slowed, wheels scraping in the wet. He opened the door himself and stepped back. "Get in!" She didn't move. "To where?" "To Stonegate Press first. I heard Fenwick mention your transcript pages. Then to your gate." His tone allowed no argument, then altered by a degree enough to acknowledge her will. "You may dismiss the driver at either stop if you choose. My man rides behind until you are inside." Patricia hesitated on the curb, rain soaking the hem she had torn for Elias. Accepting this would be seen. Refusing might be seen as well. Trade-offs again, sharp and relentless. "If I accept escort," she said, "it is for the book's security, not my own." He inclined his head once. "As you wish." She stepped into the hackney. The seat smelled of damp leather and hay. Vale spoke to the driver through the rain, clear and precise, naming the printer, then the Ericsson servant's entrance, then adding, "No detours." He handed up coin before the man could haggle. When he turned back, he set one gloved hand on the half-open door. For an instant he looked as he had in the library when Elias struggled to breathe, controlled, rigid, and one command away from fracture. "Miss Ericsson," he said. She waited. "Lock your attic door tonight." The words were quiet, final, not a suggestion. Her fingers tightened on the hymn book. "You presume I have a key." His mouth hardened. "Then move your trunk against it." "I have no trunk." A pause, very brief, very telling. "Then a chair," he said. She met his gaze across the narrow space between street and carriage, rain threading down both their faces. "I will not be frightened into obedience." "Good." His hand left the door. "Be prudent into survival." He shut the carriage door and stepped back. The hackney jolted forward. Through the small blurred pane, Patricia saw him remain in the rain, still as stone, watching until carriage and distance took him from view. The hackney lurched through standing water, wheels striking ruts hard enough to jar Patricia's bruised knee, and she held the hymn book under her shawl with one arm, while the warm parcel pressed against her ribs with the other. At Stonegate Press, she stepped down into ankle-deep runoff, crossed beneath the printer's awning, and handed Mr. Collingwood the 2 transcript pages she had copied before dawn, edges protected in waxed paper. He counted out 6pence into her palm, glanced once at the Vale rider waiting in rain behind her carriage, and wisely asked no questions. She bought a heel of brown bread from the next stall with 2 of those pennies, broke it, and forced herself to eat half before she could change her mind. The broth from Vale's parcel was still warm. She drank it in 3 careful swallows in the shadow of the press doorway, wiped the cup with her handkerchief, and gave it back to the rider when he held out his hand without a word. By the time the hackney turned into Ericsson Lane, the afternoon had gone the colour of pewter. The servants' gate stood open. Lady Ericsson stood beneath the arch in plum silk and rosewater, dry under a footman's umbrella, as if she had been waiting there long enough to make waiting itself into accusation. Rosamond and Eliza hovered a pace behind her with identical expressions of brittle curiosity. The driver reined in. Patricia stepped down with the book hidden and the sealed card still in her bodice pocket. Lady Ericsson's eyes went first to Patricia's torn hem, then to the bulge beneath the shawl. "You are late." "I completed the lace deliveries. The receipts are in my pocket." "I did not ask about lace." Lady Ericsson extended her hand. "Give me what you are hiding." Patricia did not move. "No." The word struck the stone passage harder than a shout. Rosamond's brows rose. Eliza made a small, delighted sound and then concealed it when Lady Ericsson turned her head. "You forget your place," Lady Ericsson said softly. "Footman, search her." The Vale rider moved for the first time. "No one searches Miss Ericsson without a magistrate's order." Lady Ericsson looked at him as though he were mud on her silk. "You are on my property." "I am under the Duke of Ravensmere's written instruction." At the Duke's name, both stepsisters went very still. Lady Ericsson recovered first. "Then your Duke may explain why he meddles in domestic discipline?" Her gaze cut back to Patricia. "Inside!" "Now!" She led the way to the front hall, not the kitchen corridor, because humiliation required an audience. 2 callers in wet cloaks stood by the fire, cups in hand. They fell silent when Patricia entered with mud at her hem and dark hair escaping its pins. Lady Ericsson took position beneath Anders Ericsson's portrait and let her voice carry. "This girl has been seen in private conference with our gentleman and now returns concealing stolen property. I shall have the constable." Patricia felt the old instinct to shrink. She did not obey it. She drew out the delivery receipts, set them on the console table, then placed her borrowing card beside them, Mr. Fenwick's neat mark visible. "My route is accounted for. My returns are accounted for." Lady Ericsson smiled. "How diligent! How useless! Eliza, send James for Constable Reed." Eliza ran, pleased to be useful in cruelty. Patricia turned to Martha, the kitchen maid lingering by the passage door, eyes wide with fear. "Please fetch any errand boy. Give him this card and send him to Magistrate Henshaw's office at once." She drew out Vale's sealed card and put it into Martha's shaking hand. "Now!" Lady Ericsson stepped forward and caught Patricia's wrist hard enough to make the bruise flare. "You will send nothing from this house." Patricia's breath caught. The Vale rider took 1 step in, but Patricia spoke before he could. "Martha, go." Martha went. Lady Ericsson released Patricia only when the girl had vanished down the back corridor and witnesses were watching too closely. Constable Reed arrived first, rain on his hat brim and apology already in his eyes. He had known Patricia since she was a child. He also knew wages answered to owners. "Miss Ericsson," he said carefully, "Lady Ericsson reports theft." "What item?" Patricia asked. "A family Bible," Lady Ericsson supplied smoothly. "Taken under false pretences." "It was not in this house this morning," Patricia said. "It is in your shawl now." Before Constable Reed could answer, the front bell sounded once, then again sharp and official. Footsteps crossed the vestibule. Magistrate Henshaw entered with his clerk and Mr. Fenwick at his shoulder, all three wet from the road. Duke Vale came behind them, coat dark with rain, expression carved and unreadable. Henshaw removed his gloves and looked directly at Lady Ericsson. "I received a sealed request under affidavit reference from His Grace. We shall hear this matter now." Lady Ericsson's smile thinned. "Magistrate, this is a household misunderstanding." "Then clarity will comfort you." Henshaw gestured to the centre table. "Miss Ericsson, produce the disputed book." Patricia drew the volume from beneath her shawl and set it down. Vale did not touch it. Henshaw opened the cover, read the flyleaf inscription, then turned pages until he reached the hymn margins and the hooked marks. Mr. Fenwick stepped forward, voice precise. "I witnessed the Duke present that volume at Stonegate Library. I witnessed Miss Ericsson identify the marginal hand as her late father's. I witnessed Lady Ericsson enter and accuse Miss Ericsson of theft in public language." Lady Ericsson snapped. "You witnessed gossip in a reading room." "I witnessed facts," Fenwick said, and for the first time his careful neutrality broke into something like anger. Henshaw turned to his clerk. "Day book." The clerk opened the leather ledger and read, "At 1:15 entry by rider from His Grace. Seizure episode of Master Elias Vale at Stonegate Library. Attendance by Miss Patricia Ericsson. Treatment observed. Time and place recorded." Constable Reed shifted his weight, uncomfortable and now alert. Henshaw continued leafing through the Bible. At the backboard his thumb paused over a ridge in the paste down. He took his penknife, lifted a brittle edge, and drew out a folded packet sealed in old red wax. Everyone in the room stopped breathing. The outer line read, in Anders Ericsson's hurried hand, "For any surviving child of my body, held in trust by TV if law fails." Vale's jaw tightened once at the initials. He said nothing. Henshaw broke the ancient wax and read in silence for a full minute. Then he read aloud selected lines, each one a blow delivered in legal prose. A codicil naming Patricia Ericsson, sole beneficiary of a dowry trust, trustee powers limited to stewardship, transfer of principal without beneficiary signature void, list of bond numbers, and a final attestation by 2 witnesses, one of them Theodora Vale. Lady Ericsson's colour drained. "That cannot be genuine." Henshaw held up the final page. "Your late husband's sign, his solicitor's seal, cross-referenced figures in Anders Ericsson's cipher." He looked at Patricia. "Do you possess any transfer notices bearing these bond numbers?" Patricia did. She had kept every dense, humiliating paper under her attic board. "Yes, bring them." Martha, breathless from running, appeared at the doorway with Patricia's wrapped packet already in hand. She must have guessed. Patricia took it, unwrapped the papers, and gave them to the magistrate. Henshaw scanned 3 notices, then handed them to his clerk. "Different hand in beneficiary line, unauthorised marks. Constable Reed, pending full inquiry. Lady Ericsson is suspended from guardianship and financial control over Miss Ericsson immediately." Rosamond made a frightened protest. Eliza began to cry for the first time in any room Patricia had ever seen. Lady Ericsson lifted her chin. "You cannot remove me from my own house." "I can remove your authority over this woman." Henshaw nodded to Reed. "Ensure compliance. Lady Ericsson will provide account books and keys by morning. If she refuses, she will be removed under warrant tonight." Constable Reed bowed, unhappy but firm. "Yes, sir." No one looked at Patricia. Then everyone did. Vale stepped to the table, picked up the Bible, and held it toward her. "Keep it. It was always meant for you." Her hands shook when she took it. Not from cold now, from the violent relief of proof after years of being told proof did not exist. Henshaw cleared his throat. "There remains Miss Erikson's immediate maintenance," Vale answered before Lady Erikson could form another objection. "I offer Miss Erikson paid employment as tutor and reading companion to my son under contract, not patronage. Salary quarterly, private chamber with lock, freedom to terminate with notice, terms witnessed and filed." Henshaw looked to Patricia. "Do you accept?" She met Vale's eyes. "I accept those terms if one clause is added. No punishment of the child for silence," Vale said. "Add it." The clerk wrote. Patricia signed first. Vale signed second. Henshaw and Fenwick signed as witnesses. Constable Reed added his name as attesting officer. When it was done, Henshaw handed Patricia a certified copy and tucked the original into his satchel. "Funds from the trust will require audit, but your legal name and status are restored as of this hour." Lady Erikson stood rigid beneath Anders Eriksson's portrait, silk rustling with each furious breath. She offered no apology. None was asked. Outside, rain eased to a fine mist. Vale waited in the hall while Patricia climbed once to the attic, moved the loose board, took her coins and her mother's comb, then paused with her hand on the narrow bed frame. She did not look back a second time. At the carriage she found Mrs. Davies from Ravensmere waiting with a wool cloak and a ring of keys on her belt, practical eyes kind and discreet. At Ravensmere the nursery fire was banked low and steady. Elias sat at a small table in nightshirt and blanket, bandaged hand resting on a slate. The physician's case lay open nearby. "Clean wound," he told Patricia in brisk tones. "No fever, breathing episodes likely to return under strain, but your rhythm notes are sound." Elias looked up when she entered, then pushed the slate toward her. In uneven letters he had written one word. "Stay." Patricia set the Bible on the table beside his slate and glanced toward Vale, who stood in the doorway, broad shoulders filling it, face unreadable except for the strain he no longer bothered to hide. He spoke only once. "Stay." She touched the edge of the slate with 2 fingers and answered him without lowering her eyes. "I will,"